Welcome to our Curious Amalgam, the weekly podcast brought to you by the Antitrust Law section of the American Bar Association. Our Curious Amalgam explores the fascinating and increasingly overlapping world of competition, consumer protection, data protection, and privacy law. Each week, we bring you leading global experts on the most compelling issues of the day. Enjoy the show.
Welcome to our Curious Amalgam. I'm Alicia Downey, and the title of today's episode is How Did Antitrust Law Help Defeat the Ku Klux Klan? The Antitrust Law Section's Diversity.Advanced Committee is hosting a special live event in January featuring a reenactment of the famous 1981 trial in the case of Vietnamese Fishermen's Association versus the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. One of the goals of the reenactment is to shed light on how antitrust claims arose in the context of a civil rights case, and whether antitrust law should play a role or can play a role in resolving civil rights and diversity issues. The event takes place January 16, 2024 in the afternoon at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. But even if you can't attend, or if you're listening to this episode long after the event's already taken place, the famous case that inspired it and its potential implications for antitrust enforcement as a tool for protecting and preserving civil rights is a fascinating subject. My co-host today is Derek Jackson. Hi, Derek.
Hi, Alicia.
Derek, would you like to introduce our guest and kick off the conversation?
Sure. We're joined today by Charles Moore. Charles is a counsel in White & Case's antitrust group in Washington, D.C., where he works on antitrust litigation, government investigations, compliance, and I understand even the occasional merger. Charles is also an active member in the Antitrust Law section. Welcome to our Curious Amalgam, Charles.
Derek and Alicia, thank you so much for allowing me to join you today.
Wonderful. We're happy to have you. Can you give us a little bit of background on the case that inspired this Diversity.Advanced Committee program?
Ultimately, the case is Vietnamese Fisherman Association versus the Ku Klux Klan. It's a case that the Southern Poverty Law Center brought back in April of 1981. It was a case that Judge Gabrielle Kirk McDonald, who was on the Southern District of Texas, decided by preliminary and then permanent injunction. And the essential focus of it is that it has its roots in the post-Vietnam War period, where we had Vietnamese fishermen who were operating in Galveston Bay and in Louisiana and certain other places in that sort of Texas, Louisiana area. And we had the Ku Klux Klan literally robed and geared up, participating in paramilitary operations to assist in essentially terrorizing these fishermen and trying to prevent them from doing their business. That's the context of this. And ultimately, Southern Poverty Law Center stepped in, filed this lawsuit. It focused, generally speaking, on the standard civil rights statutes that we would think about, as well as some Texas law statutes, but also thrown in were a couple of antitrust claims, a Section 1 claim of conspiracy to monopolize and a Section 2 claim of monopolization as well. And so literally there were Ku Klux Klan members who were defendants, Louis Beam and some other folks who were defendants in the case. And that's the context of the antitrust claims that arose in this matter.
In antitrust context, we're used to talking about the concept of anti-competitive conduct, and usually by that we have in mind some sort of market activity. But in this case, we're truly talking about actual threats of intimidation and violence to try to keep certain people out of the market. Was that kind of a novel idea to use antitrust in that context at the time?
Novel is an interesting word. So it certainly isn't something that we've seen a lot of. However, looking at scholarship for this, there were some cases back in the 30s, believe it or not. I think it's U.S. versus Union Pacific Produce Company, and another case in 1939, I think it was U.S. versus Barrett Company. Both of those cases, if I remember correctly, were focused on artichoke farmers, and there were threats and intimidation and other sorts of improper activities associated with trying to prevent certain farmers from engaging in their business. And so the DOJ actually brought criminal Section 2 claims, charges against those defendants in those cases. So we've seen it before in the general sense, but we have not seen that in a long time. I will note, though, that as of right now, at least to the best that I can tell, in late December of last year, 2022, DOJ brought another case in the Transflagrante matter that unsealed the indictment, making another asserting another set of Section 2 criminal charges against certain defendants in that case. So we're seeing perhaps more of that if that Transmigrante case from last year is an example and a harbinger of things to come. And we certainly have seen this before, but it is not a common strategy to employ a Section 2 related charges in this context.
And I think we might come back to the Section 2 cases and what this means for the future of antitrust enforcement in a second. Going back to the Vietnamese Fisherman case for a minute, you mentioned the Southern Poverty Law Center brought both civil rights claims, antitrust claims in addition to those. Can you tell us a little more about their strategy and how they went forward with the case?
Sure. Of course, with the civil rights claims, thinking of the Ku Klux Klan being involved, we can imagine that those are the standard sort of violation of rights sorts of claims that they brought. There were some Texas-specific claims as well, because there are certain Texas laws that came into play with respect to what the Ku Klux Klan was doing. Ku Klux Klan had organized essentially a paramilitary operation, I believe called the Texas Emergency Reserve. And so there were some claims associated with what the Ku Klux Klan was doing with respect to that, some state law claims like tortious interference, other claims like that. And with respect to the antitrust part of it, this is an interesting deal because the antitrust part of it wasn't a huge part of the decision that Judge McDonald issued. It came at the end as we looked at all the civil rights claims, the 42 U.S.C. sorts of claims that the plaintiffs brought. And then we look at the end of it and Judge McDonald issued a ruling. In fact, it's a split decision with respect to the antitrust claims. On the Section 1 claim, the conspiracy to monopolize, Judge McDonald found there was a likely success on the merits and therefore granted the preliminary injunction on that basis, along with the other bases that we had. But on the Section 2 claim, Judge McDonald found that there wasn't necessarily sufficient evidence to show that the Ku Klux Klan had market power, a traditional Section 2 claim. So an interesting split decision in that regard. But one of the things that we look at, again, in the context now of thinking about this expanded way that folks might use antitrust claims to address all kinds of other issues, aside from just the pure kind of market dynamics that we're normally used to thinking about, that we thought this was a really interesting way of not only talking about Section 1 and 2 in a creative way, but in the context of a diversity-related issue that would be well within the ambit of Diversity.Advanced.
And let's talk a little bit about the project itself, too. I went to the event webpage, and you've got a big list of faculty. I assume some people are going to be actually playing roles in this reenactment. I'm not sure I would want to volunteer to play the role of the defense counsel or his clients. In fact, I read in some of the background reading I did that they actually had robed Klansmen in the courtroom during this preliminary injunction hearing. So I'm not sure how far you're going to go in your reenactment of the hearing. How is this going to be set up? Are you really going to try to reenact the whole thing, or snippets or highlights, or maybe just focus on the antitrust things?
So this is a pretty wonderful deal. The Asian American Bar Association of New York, and we want to give that association credit, has drafted a sort of a script, a reenactment script that other folks have used. I've actually seen this in action, and it is an extremely moving presentation to see the reenactment. And so we're going to use that script to do an actual reenactment. I don't know, quite frankly, that, to your point, Alicia, that we'll have folks put on the full gear. I think that, though, that having people hear some of those words, some of the testimony that actually came from the case, probably will be jarring enough in terms of the impact that it'll have, and thinking about where we were and what these issues really are even today. We'll have that script, and then following the reenactment, we'll have a panel discussion that talks about the larger question of how antitrust might play a role in resolving other sorts of issues or other sorts of contexts than the traditional context in which we've been using antitrust over the last 40 or 50 years. So that's the agenda as we lay it out. So we have a couple folks will be on the panel, and then some of the names that you see in terms of the speakers, those are our actors, our cast. And so hopefully they have better acting skills than I do. Certainly, like you, I'm not sure that anyone would want to see me acting in anything, but I have great confidence that our folks who have volunteered will be awesome actors in our cast.
And then one of the main characters, of course, is Judge Gabrielle Kirk McDonald, who presided over the hearing and issued both the preliminary injunction hearing. There is a later decision in which she contended with the specific question about this reserve militia and its legality under Texas law, which doesn't deal with antitrust issues, but they're both very interesting. Judge McDonald had only relatively recently been appointed to that bench at the time of this hearing, but she went on to become an absolute legend. Do you want to tell listeners a little bit about her?
Judge McDonald is unbelievable. And I think, Alicia, we use the word legend and we use icon and we use a lot of those words frequently in a variety of contexts. They absolutely apply to Judge McDonald. She went to Howard Law School, graduated from Howard, then went to work for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And if you can imagine at that time in our country, this is even before, obviously, this matter with the Vietnamese fishermen, that she was fighting on the front lines of a lot of these civil rights sorts of cases in the 60s and managing a lot of those issues alongside other legends in the civil rights sphere, whose names we know really well. She went into academia. And to your point, President Carter, whom, of course, has been in the news recently, appointed her in 1979 to the Southern District of Texas. And she was confirmed in 1979 and received her commission. She was 37 years old. So the first African-American appointed to the federal bench in Texas, only the third African-American woman to be appointed as a federal judge in the U.S. at the time. And she resigned back in 1988. Then she went on to become a member of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, working on these international issues with respect to certain war crimes trials. The first war crimes trial since the Nuremberg trials. She was involved in that matter as well. And after with the criminal tribunal, she went and worked on the Iran-United States Claims Tribunal. Judge McDonald, in addition to contributing greatly to our U.S. legal system as first working for the NAACP and ensuring civil rights, and then being appointed to the federal bench, also contributed greatly to global international law, working on these two tribunals and making sure that we had justice served everywhere. So unbelievable career, and she absolutely is a legend.
And I understand, too, going back to 1981, that the KKK's lawyers tried to get her to recuse herself, claiming she would be naturally biased against them, and that she refused.
Charles, it's clearly a very fascinating case, and I think a lot of us in the section are going to be very interested to see the mock trial reenactment. Zooming out a little bit and maybe touching on some of the big picture topics you briefly referred to earlier. In our current antitrust moment, there's a lot of rethinking being done about policy, and one of those big questions that people are discussing is, should the role of antitrust extend beyond what we think of narrowly as economic questions into some of these social and political areas? Do you think this case can teach us anything about that or inform the current debate on that question?
Thanks, Derek. I think it can, although, of course, this is a very specific set of circumstances. With, again, as Alicia pointed out, we had robed Klansmen who were testifying at this preliminary injunction hearing trial, and obviously a well-known organization for terrorism, domestic terrorism, as it were, and in the civil rights context as well. And the extent to which that would help folks expand antitrust beyond its normal sort of areas of focus is an interesting and open question in terms of how all of that works, because of the kind of uniqueness of having the Ku Klux Klan as a defendant in this case, among other things. That said, I think one of the things I'll point out is the section's actually done a pretty good job of getting this conversation started. Last year's fall forum, this fall forum in 2022, that was one of the questions around the consumer welfare standard and what we're doing and how we expand the role of antitrust, or if we expand the role of antitrust as well. And so this conversation has been going on within the section for some period of time, as well as in larger antitrust circles. So we'll have to see exactly what happens. That again, as I just mentioned a few minutes ago, DOJ has brought this transflagrante case with a similar sort of allegation of violence, criminal Section 2, and we certainly heard conversations around whether you can use Section 2 in the civil rights context and other contexts. And it may be that this becomes yet another important data point, or at least, if not one that people think of immediately, one as they are researching whether there are novel ways to use the antitrust laws, one that they find and that they're able to utilize in the arsenal of antitrust-related arguments. So it's very possible that this will be a harbinger of things to come in terms of how we use antitrust, both in the criminal context, the case that DOJ currently has, and this, of course, is a civil case, right? And the civil context by private plaintiffs as well.
Yeah, I guess it really remains to be seen exactly where DOJ will go with bringing some of these Section 2 cases that as you mentioned earlier, maybe aren't new. There's maybe some historical precedent, but they haven't been brought in quite some time. Of course, in this case, interestingly, as you noted, it was actually the Section 1 claims that won the day at the injunction hearing, and the Section 2 claims failed for lack of market power. It really does depend on the unique set of facts that folks will be confronting in each case. Is that fair to say?
It absolutely is. I found that to be very interesting, ultimately, that Judge McDonnell found there is a conspiracy, right? You have all these individuals who really are making a concerted effort to drive this particular set of business folks out of the market, right? The KKK is literally helping others drive these Vietnamese fishermen out of the market in Texas and perhaps in Louisiana as well, on the one hand. But on the other hand, you then have the normal benchmarks that you have to meet for Section 2 claims. And one of them is market power and some of the other things. And the question is whether these particular KKK defendants had market power in the relevant market. And so you end up having to do that traditional antitrust analysis and looking at what the evidence is with respect to that Section 2 related claim. So that's exactly right. I think that we really do have to see where those might merge a little bit more closely, right? So you're not necessarily having the Ku Klux Klan or some other sort of outside organization that may or may not be in the same business as the folks who would stand to benefit from having the market to themselves. But you have the folks who actually are in that business, seeing how those folks might fare in a case where you have a little bit closer sort of connection between the actual business people who are looking to protect their market share and the violence or other sorts of tactics that might be improper in terms of the claims that you might have with respect to those.
It's a very important case for Asian Americans and their legal history in this United States. Don't forget the Korematsu case about the Japanese internment. So it's no surprise that the New York Asian American Bar Association came up with this script. Do you know if the antitrust law section is first, second, third, fourth, 10th, 20th organization to present it?
I don't know where we are in all of this. I do know that this has been around for some time. So what the reenactment that I saw was a couple of years ago. It was during the pandemic, so I watched it virtually. But this has been out there, and I think there are a variety of law firms that have put this reenactment on using this particular script. So the AABA-NY is not new to this at all. It's been doing this for some period of time, and we're really grateful. To your point, Alicia, about the importance of this case, one of the things that really attracted us to it is that we were looking at ways to highlight antitrust in the context of, to your point, in the context of civil rights, the context of aiding our various communities. And so we were looking for an opportunity to put on this reenactment, both because of the educational value and also because of a different sort of program than we might normally do. I know that we have a mock trial at the spring meeting, but it's hard to have those reenactments and then have a panel and have other things. It gave us an opportunity to be creative about the programming and the information that we were passing along to our audience. Really looking forward to supporting our Asian American colleagues who are part of the section and who wanted us to put this on. And so that's going to be a really fantastic opportunity here for us to see this happen.
And your faculty and the participants, the actors, as you call them, are antitrust practitioners from all sorts of settings. We've got folks from private firms like you. We've got some economists from Edgeworth, Berkeley Research Group, and Cornerstone Research. Got a couple of folks from Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission, and at least a couple of in-house counsel as well. So I think it's a great cross-section of the antitrust law section. It's a great cross-section showing the diversity of the section. Will there be a video that's available for people to watch afterwards? I know the section has a YouTube channel. It'd be great if they could post it there.
That's great. I think this will only be an in-person event, but I'm happy to raise that as we get closer to see whether there's anything that we can manage. But I think it's an in-person event in terms of what we'll end up doing. So I don't know whether there will be video associated with it. So I say that to say, if you're in D.C., you're going to be in D.C. on January 16th, please join us in person. We've got plenty of spaces at the National Press Club. For those who were at the merger conference back in September, you know that space. I think we've also used the National Press Club for some of our spring meeting programs in prior years. So we've got this space. We love to have folks come by as well to enjoy it in person. And then to your point, it actually really reminds me to make sure that I acknowledge June Kelselmeyer, who's at Verizon. You mentioned June, who's going to be on our panel and Michelle Rendon, who is one of DA's co-chairs, who's going to participate as well. And both of them are wonderful. And this has really been theirs, and Pooja Patel, who's at Allen Overy, really their brainchild. And so I'm really humbled to be, in some ways, the person who's kind of carrying this forward, right, as co-chair. But I don't really deserve the credit for it. They really did the legwork to push this forward and to make sure that we had a project and a proposal for the section for this DA program that would be interesting to folks, that would be educational to folks, and that would be thought-provoking. So we certainly want to make sure that we give the credit where the credit is due. I'm here doing this podcast with you, but really the credit belongs to so many other folks.
They're going to put you to work as the moderator, so I think, but you'll do an excellent job, I'm sure. As we round out the discussion, I just want listeners who might want some more information, can't get to the event, but would like to educate themselves a little bit more about this very interesting piece of legal history. You can, of course, find the preliminary injunction decision itself. Let's see, the citation is Vietnamese Fishermen's Association versus the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. That is 518 F Sup 993. We'll put a link to the decision itself on the web page for this episode. And along with that, a link to at least 2 other resources that I recommend. There's a great article posted online by University of North Carolina law professor Andrew Chin about the case itself with some interesting background. Also, Houston's public radio station has published a podcast about this event as well, so about the case itself. So I recommend both of those things, and we'll try to have links available.
I would also add Judge McDonald's permanent injunction ruling is something you can find at 543 F Sup 198. It actually was issued in June of 1982, so that you have that as well. So you have the preliminary. It's important to read the preliminary injunction memorandum and order because that actually has all the facts. So you can see some of the testimony and some of the things that were there. And there's a little bit of that, I think, in the permanent injunction order as well. But if you're interested in following up to see how she came out on the final order, that 543 F Sup 198 citation will take you to that order in June of 1982.
Okay, we'll be sure to have both of them on the episode webpage. So everybody put your research hats on. Anyway, I learned a lot just doing the background for this episode. It was very interesting. Before we let you go, however, Charles, we're going to do a couple of things we do with every guest on our Curious Amalgam to get to know you a little bit better as a person. The first question we want to ask is, tell us something interesting about yourself that is outside of your professional life.
I'll mention a couple of things. One of them is that I'm actually from Washington, D.C., born and raised in the city. Typically, people will say I'm from D.C., but they'll be from one of the suburbs there. That is something that I take some pride in. And people are like, I've never met anybody who's actually from D.C., but I'm actually from D.C. And perhaps what I'll do is I'll hold the second one and I'll see what other questions that you have. And maybe I'll throw that one out there once I see where it is. It's not, doesn't cover this, then I'll go for that.
You just blurt it out later. Okay. Next thing we'll do is we'll play a little game that we call the Curious Hat.
And now it's time for the Curious Hat.
The rules of the game are very simple. We're going to pretend to draw a random question from a virtual, non-existent hat. And it's a total surprise. You've never heard this question before. And I'm going to ask Derek, would you please do the honors and read the surprise question to Charles?
Charles, your Curious Hat question today is, tell us about a teacher who had a major influence on you.
Ooh, there are a lot of those. There are a lot of teachers. My mom was a school teacher, a public school teacher in D.C. So I have great respect for school teachers. You are really going to put me on the spot here. And this is not to slight any of my other professors or teachers over the years. All of them have been wonderful, but I'll give you a couple. So Miss Gaucher was my second grade teacher. I remember that. I'm not going to tell you how old I am, but let's just say that goes back several years, right?
What was her name again?
Gaucher, G-O-C-H-E.
Miss Gaucher. Okay.
Yeah, Miss Gaucher. That goes back probably to about the time of this case that we're talking about, when it's somewhere in that vintage. And obviously you're saying, what am I learning in second grade? But just making sure that I understood what was going on and all of those things. My sister, I have two older sisters, they went to the same school. And so as you come behind folks, you're always worried about what that pressure looks like. I've got to do certain things with the family, but it always made me feel at home. I had a professor in college, his name was Charles Harris, another one, Professor McCormick. Dr. McCormick, both of those professors were instrumental in making sure that I understood the lay of the land, understood kind of the political implications of things, but also if I was going to go to law school, so what all that meant, and making sure that I was in the right place and thinking about the right kinds of things in terms of what I would be when I grew up. And then in law school, I had a bunch of professors. Lisa Crooms is now the dean at Howard, interim dean at Howard is one of them, and Professor Newsom as well, who wrote my clerkship sort of recommendation. And I'm going to tell you right now, however many years ago that was, I still don't recognize that guy. I would hire that guy today, even if I wouldn't necessarily hire myself, but I hired that guy today. I read the recommendation when he sent it in. I'm like, who's this guy? Like, how did this happen? And I really have to thank him along with, and Andy Gavel, of course, whom you all know, who is my professor and has become a great friend over the years. And so Andy has had a profound impact on my life and my career as well. So there are a whole bunch of folks, and there are other folks I haven't mentioned. And so I want to apologize to anybody who sees this and says, wait a minute, I helped this guy out too.
If this were your Oscar speech, we'd be playing the music. It's getting louder and louder and louder. Okay. No, it's wonderful to hear the appreciation that you have for so many teachers. And yeah, starting from the second grade all the way up to law school, which is, I don't know, the 24th grade?
That's right.
Anyway.
And in fact, starting from your mother, who you said was a school teacher.
The thing that I noticed is we go to the mall, go places, and I'm like, what are we doing? And people would stop her and they'd say, oh, there's more. You help me, blah, 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 blah. And as a kid, you're like, I just want to go buy this sweatshirt I need or these pencils or whatever it is that you're doing. And as I have gotten older, I have my own family, that sort of thing, you really, and to see the impact that some of those folks I just mentioned, as well as others, had on my own life, you understand what that really means. And so I've really come to appreciate that a lot more as I've gotten older.
That's a wonderful way to end this episode. Thank you for being a great guest. Thank you, Derek, for being a great co-host. Listeners, check out the resources on this webpage. Get to the event on January 16th, 2024 at the National Press Club if you can. Thank you for listening, and tune in to the next, Our Curious Amalgam.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Our Curious Amalgam, a competition, consumer protection, data protection, and privacy law podcast. It is produced and shared around the globe by ABA's Antitrust Law Section. The opinions expressed by the participants in this podcast are their own and do not necessarily represent their employer or other organizations. If you like what you heard or would like to become a member of the American Bar Association, please check out what the Antitrust section has to offer at ambar.org/antitrust. You can learn more about our podcast at ourcuriousamalgam.com. If you have comments, suggestions, or podcast ideas, please reach out to us at podcast@ourcuriousamalgam.com. Until next time, thank you for listening.